In this lesson, we're going to be breaking down the different container layout styles available to you with Bubble's newest responsive engine. Layout styles are applied to containers. A container is any kind of element that can be the parent of another element. Okay, so your container elements that you see over here on the left-hand side, groups, repeating groups, pop-ups, right? These can have other elements inside of them, therefore they are a container. The page is also one giant container, right? Everything gets added to your page to kick things off. So when you go to the property editor of a container, you can head over to the second tab here, this layout tab, and you can choose a specific layout style for that container. And what this means is that the inner elements will be positioned within that container in a certain way, right? These will dictate how the inner elements are positioned inside of that container. Okay, so we're going to take a look at all four layout styles so you can see what the behaviors are, and we're going to go over some best practices so you know which layouts to choose for your application's needs. The first layout style is the fixed style. Now this is the only non-responsive style. This is essentially what you see is exactly what you get. Bubble will not snap anything for you. Nothing's really going to fall on a grid. It's completely your responsibility to align everything evenly, distribute everything evenly, so you have more finer control over that. But I would recommend you get in the habit of using a responsive layout to keep your designs, looking really great on different device sizes, and to allow Bubble to do more of that heavy lifting for you, to space things out for you, to position things more evenly for you. Really, at the end of the day, everything should fall on a grid. That's what's going to keep your designs much more intuitive for your users and more familiar for them, right? So here's the behavior of the fixed layout. If I add a button to my page, Bubble's not going to move it. It is exactly it's just going to leave it alone where I've placed it. If I move it over here or down here, right, and I can create other buttons on my page, there's no snapping that's involved. Bubble just leaves them alone. All right. Now, if I change the page's layout style to an align to parent, let me remove my elements here for a second. If I change this to align to parent, what's going to happen with this style is that the container is going to be broken up into 9 different sections, or nonents as they're called. And this is what that means. I'm going to take a button, and you see that before I add it, I can hover over the page and you'll see the different sections. It's a grid of 9 squares. So if I drop my button here, Bubble will place it perfectly centered in the page. If I move it ever so slightly to the right, and it's now moving over to this middle right section, and I let go, Bubble's going to snap it to the very right edge of that middle right section, right? I can move it over here to the top left corner, and Bubble just snaps those things in place. I can also reposition an element within an align to parent container by going to the property editor of the element itself. If I head over to the layout tab, you'll see that this selector is available here for me, and I can move it around that way as well. It's just another way to reposition them. Okay. Now let's look at the behavior for the row style. Again, we're at the page level here, so this is affecting the entire positioning of elements on my page. So if I select row, you'll notice that the button automatically snapped to the upper left corner. And I'm going to change the style here of this button so we can keep it apart from a few other buttons that I'll be creating. So I'll copy this and paste this, change this to, let's do like the standard button. I'm going to do one more button here, and let's change this to success. Okay, so as I added more buttons, you see that everything stacks horizontally. Okay, if I change the layout style of the page to column, then you'll see that things stack vertically. Right? That's the difference between those. Now I can pick up my element and again rearrange them, and you'll see that as I pick up an element, the other elements kind of get faded out, and there's this blue bar that shows up to show me where I'm going to reposition the element that I'm currently holding. So if I let go here, it's going to move it up at the top. Same thing happens when I'm on the column layout style. If I pick up an element here and rearrange it, it'll move it down there. By the way, you can also move these around by working with your elements tree. So I can actually drag and drop these things here, and it will reflect on my canvas directly as well. Now let's take a look at some of the other controls that you have available to you when you change these different layout styles. So we'll stay on column here. And you'll notice that there's a checkbox, apply gap spacing between elements. So this is going to help you create spacing between all of your elements in your column. So if I change this to like a 20 pixel gap spacing, there's now 20 pixels evenly between each of my elements. I could increase this if I want, right? And even as I add more elements, so let me add another red button here. I'm just going to copy and paste that. I can move this around. It's going to maintain that 50 pixel now, that 50 pixel gap spacing between my my column elements. If I switch this over to a row, then I now have both row and column available to me, and I'll explain why. So let's actually change this to 0 for a second, change this to 50. Okay, so this is the column gap between each row item. Hopefully that makes sense, right? Each of these kind of create their own column, but as a whole, they are in one row. This is one line. Now, the reason the row layout style also has the ability to create row gap spacing is because if I run out of room to display all of my elements on one line, Bubble's going to wrap this to a second line. And I can control the spacing of the row gap of those elements. So let me pull up here. If I change, let's actually, there's some stretching happening here. Let me see here. Let's do a 50. You see how that pushed that down a little bit like this? But I do want these to snap up to the, so that we meet the edges here for a second, and something is forcing it. I think it's the minimum height of my page. Yes, that was forcing it to expand down to the page. And so they were just going to take up as much room as they could on the page. So if I remove the row gap, this is kind of that default behavior that you would see without that, right? It just moves directly onto the next line, and I could keep going to a third line like that, right? And so if I come back to my page and add a row gap of, let's say, 100 pixels, we can really create our own grid structure here. Okay, so those gap spacings are very, very helpful for creating very quick, even distribution and alignment between your elements. We do have margin and padding controls to create spacing around individual elements or inside of individual elements. We'll touch on those in another video. But as a whole, within the container, it's very helpful to have this gap spacing here. Now let's take a look at some of the general alignment settings that are available to you for both row and column layout styles. I'm going to make the minimum page height back to, let's say, 1000 pixels here, just so we have some breathing room. Okay, so with a row style, I'm going to get rid of my column. I'm just going to get rid of my gap spacing altogether to really highlight this alignment setting here. You can see that right now everything is positioned left aligned. So we start on the left side of the screen and everything will stack from left to right. But we can do the opposite by right aligning, right? Everything starts from the right and will stack from right to left. I can center my elements, okay? Or I can have space around my elements. That means that it'll expand to the full width of their container. In this case, it's just the page, and leave space around, starting with the space around the outermost elements. Okay, so we have space on the very right, space on the left, and then even spacing in between. Versus space between. That means that we push the left, the outer elements, the left and the right red buttons, go all the way to the edges of their parent. Again, in this case, it's the page, and then even spacing in between the rest of the elements. You can mix and match these controls with, your gap spacing as well to create more custom spacing. So if I wanted to center everything, but then give them a gap spacing, let's give this, a gap spacing of maybe 5 pixels or 10 pixels, right? I have everything perfectly centered, but not right next to each other. Okay, so all of these different controls you can combine in a number of different ways to really fine-tune your layout. So I really encourage you to get hands-on with all of these different settings to create the exact layout styles that you're looking for. Now, if we switch over to the column layout style, we have, let's see, if I go over to the element itself, you can horizontally align that element within the column. Okay, this is per element, okay, and I can horizontally align this centered within the column or all the way to the right, right? So I can move these all centered. This is, so if you imagine the entire page is one giant column, and I've just placed all of the column elements perfectly centered down the middle of the page. And imagine if you had groups that were creating sections of your page, right? This group could be a big section that I want perfectly centered and I have some spacing on the left and right. Okay, so that is what that horizontal alignment is going to help you with. And I'm actually just going to remind myself here, let's go back to the row. Let me get rid of this group. And yes, so you also have the same here with your vertical alignment. I missed this one when we were looking at the row structure. So right now, everything is vertically aligned to the very top of the row. So right now, imagine that your page is one giant row. I'm actually going to demonstrate this hopefully a little bit more clearly with a group because again, these layout styles apply to any container element, not just the page. So let me give this group a quick background color so that we can see this more clearly. And I'm going to put a button or a couple buttons in here. So right now you can tell, can you guess what layout style the group is that's allowing me to overlap it? Okay, it's fixed, right? Because we don't have any snapping to any part of a grid. So I'm going to change this group's layout style to a row. That way it snaps everything there. The page is also a row. I could change it to a column. That's fine, right? Look how it moved my group over to the left. So I can move the group centered, right? That's horizontal alignment of the group is now centered in the page, which is the column. But inside of the group, which is set up as a row, we have elements falling in a row. Okay, and remember, I can space these apart like that. I have many different ways of doing that. But these elements individually inside of my group can also be vertically aligned. Right now they're snapping to the very top. I mean, I have a very tall group, but if I wanted them in the very middle, right, then I can move these vertically aligned. That one's at the very bottom. That one's vertically aligned in the center of its parent. Okay, and as I add more elements to this group, let's go on, let's watch it kind of go to a second line there. You see how it keeps it vertically aligned, but we need to take into account that we have two rows here. And here's where you can really fine tune, you know, your height settings, your minimum heights, the gap spacing between your elements as well. There's a lot of control you have over that. Let's say we go back to one row here and we use this stretch feature. You see what happened there? Bubble is not going to confine the height of that button to any of the settings that you have here. You can even see that there's an explanation. This element is stretching to its maximum height because of its alignment. And notice that it only stretches to the boundaries of its parent. You want to keep that in mind. With all these settings, everything is always relative to its parent, right? When you're working with minimum widths and maximum widths, or this alignment, it's always relative to its most immediate parent container. So if you feel like you aren't able to have things constrained in the way you want, you may just need to add more containers. You can have groups within groups to really create the exact layout styles you're looking for. All right, the last thing I want to go over in this video is just to show you a couple of real-world examples of how grids are everywhere. You want to start thinking on a grid. If you create things with rows and columns in mind, you're going to have very clean designs. So let's take a look at Airbnb, for example. This is their home page, and imagine the page itself is set to a column layout style. As I scroll down the page, I can get to more sections. Right, so one giant column with everything centered on the page, right? We have a little bit of space on the left and a little bit of space on the right. So everything is horizontally aligned within that column centered. And my individual column elements can be different layout styles to create, you know, this looks more like an aligned parent. This is a row structure. This is another row structure. We had a very clear example here of row structure. For these cards, they're stacked horizontally, but even within the card, we have a column structure to stack vertically the image, the text, and the second text there. Now, I'm going to show you how we can quickly create a wireframe with a layout like this in the editor. We'll use this as our reference, okay? So the page itself is going to be set to a column, and I will say that your fallback layout style for your pages are generally, it should be a column. Most web pages will naturally scroll up and down. Of course, there are exceptions. Of course, you might have other unique layout styles where it makes more sense to structure things as a row. Align to parent is going to be less frequently used at the page level, but a good example would be like a sign up form where that's the only thing that you have on the page and you want it dead center in the page. That's a great use case for align to parent at the page level. But again, if when in doubt, right, go with a column. And if you're finding that you're struggling with positioning things at the page level, then you can switch it to a row and see how that might change things for you. So we're going to start with a column here, and I'm going to add my first group to the page to act as my header. So this group, let's just make it that black color here. And I'm going to change the layout style of the group to a row. All right, so let's say that this is the first row up here. We've got our logo on the left, the text in the middle, the menu items, and then some other content over here. I'm not going to rebuild this page. I'm just going to show you more of a wireframe, the different containers and the styles that I would set to create that same effect. Now notice that this row is not expanding to the full width. We'll talk about widths a little bit more detail in other videos, but what I'm going to do for now is just remove the fixed width setting so that it does expand. So now remember, this layout is set to a row. So I'm going to let's add over here, let's do a text inside of our group, and I'm going to make this white so that we can see it. And I'm just going to call this logo like that. All right, I might make it a little bit bigger. Now this logo is snapping to the very left, and you can see that it's at the top vertically aligned. I want it to be centered. Okay, and I do want there to be a little bit of breathing room on the left-hand side. I don't want it right at the very edge of the page. So before I work with my spacing, I'm just going to add all of my elements to the page first. So we've got 3 menu items in the middle. Let's represent those with some buttons. Let's change this to a transparent, oh, not the transparent. Let's do, I want a white button. Let's do this one. Okay, so let's say menu 1 and menu 2. And menu 3. Okay, so we've got those 3 sections. Again, I'm not working on the spacing quite yet or their positioning. I just need them in the order in my header group. And then we've got the content over on the right. I'm just going to copy this text over here, and I'm going to grab this text, make it the last item in my my row here. I don't know if I went over this earlier. I don't think I did, but these buttons here let you change the positioning just like you can drag and drop things around in your elements tree or just visually here with your cursor. You can also select your element and move them back and forth within the row or column. This is also available in your column layout style. All right, so this text is going to be, let's say, user info. And I'm going to do another final one, let's say settings, just to have a couple of things here. Okay, so first thing is that the logo is all the way to the left, these items are all the way to the right, and these menu items are in the middle with a little bit of spacing in between. So first thing I'm going to do is change the overall distribution of my row elements and say I want some space around them. That way I get some breathing room to the left of the logo and to the right of this rightmost element here, the settings text. Now, these 3 items, I want to be perfectly centered inside of the group. Now, some of my elements are sort of getting in my way, right? This logo text is way too long. I don't need it to be that long, and that's because it has a fixed width. So I'm going to remove that width for now and have it fit to content. Let's also remove the minimum so that it can fit perfectly around the text like that. I'm going to do the same thing for settings, remove the fixed, remove the minimum and make it fit to content. Same thing for the user info text, remove the minimum, remove the fixed, and have it fit to content. Okay, so here we have our space around alignment. This is at the group level, right? That's the parent. And everything has even spacing in between with some space on the left and the right side. Now, to push these 3 menu items perfectly centered and to push these items more to the right, I want to group them together. Again, leverage your groups. They give you control. They help you refine and fine tune your positioning. So I'm going to take these 2 elements. I'm holding down my shift key to multi-select them, right click them, and I can do this is like a shortcut where I can group them together with the layout style automatically set to rows. So it saves me a couple clicks here. I'm going to click on that, grouping them as a row, and now the group itself is the rightmost element. Okay, now this group I'm also going to remove the minimum so that it, keeps them together. Now this group, right, let's call this group right, also has container alignment, and I can add some gap spacing. Let's add a little bit of gap spacing here, maybe 10 pixels in between, give it a little bit of breathing room, right? Now I'm going to do the same thing with my menu items. I will multi-select, just holding down my shift key as I click, right click it and group these three things into a row container. All right, Bubble did that work. I'm going to remove this minimum so that the group fits to content. I'm also going to center the vertical alignment and give it some gap spacing. Let's do again, just like 10 pixels. Now we're looking much closer to, the positioning here. This is more to the left, this is to the right, and we have these centered with a little bit of spacing in between. Okay, now I could of course go on with this and really fine tune it, but let's take a look at the responsive settings for this. If I expand the width of my page, you see how everything remains in the position that I've left it. We've got some minimums and maximums that we can fine tune here so that this continues to move over to the right. But see how by changing your layout styles, changing your alignments, grouping things strategically can allow you to position things exactly where you want them, even though you're not freely dragging and dropping things. And what I didn't have to do here was count pixels. I didn't have to continuously align things or recenter things. It's just happening for me by selecting these different alignment settings. Okay, now if I were to continue moving down on the page, I've got this big group here with this colored background and some information centered. So the way that I would accomplish this is take one giant group. Notice that this group snapped to right below my header group, right? We'll call this group header because my page is set to a column, which is what I want. Okay, so this group, let's give it that big bright pink background like this. And in the layout style, I'm going to center its horizontal alignment, and I'm going to create some gap spacing here to give it a little bit of breathing room away from the header. So anything else that I add to the page, right? So if I add another group, there's also 50 pixel spacing to have even distribution there. And this one I would also horizontally align, right? So now that I have this group here, I can set this to an aligned to parent style. It looks like Bubble shifted that back over for me, so let me correct that. And I can add another group, one more group here, which is, let me give it some dimensions here, 100 by 100. Let's start there. Now let's do maybe 300, like this. And so this element is centered inside of its parent, right? We'll call this group pink. This element is group white, just so that we're clear on where we're at in our hierarchy here. And this group white is going to be layout style of column, right? Because I want to stack this text on top of that button. Okay, so I can have a text here that is going to say my big title, right? And I want that one to also be centered horizontally. I don't want it to be wider than it needs to be. I'm just going to fit it directly around my text. Also the height, I can do the same thing. I can get rid of the minimum so it's perfectly there. And then I can add a button here below it because this is a column. It'll stack below my button, right? And so this button will also be horizontally aligned. And notice how they're both positioned at the very top of the group, right? This group is a column. And if I wanted to have it more centered inside of my big pink group, what I would do is actually take the white group and remove the height, okay, so that it fits perfectly around those elements, like this, okay, and because that white group is centered in the pink group, now my content inside of the white group is centered as well. And I do want a little bit of spacing between those things, so maybe I'll do like 40 pixels. Maybe that's a little bit too much, I think. 20 pixels. Anyway, hopefully you get the idea here, right? I'm nesting things. I'm changing the alignments, changing the layout styles, mixing and matching things so that they're positioned properly. Okay, one more example here to replicate what we're seeing in this Airbnb landing page is this one right here. This is a very popular design, this card structure. And normally I would do this with the repeating group, which will actually do a lot of the work for you for separating designs that should be identical, but I'm going to show you a more manual way to do it, again, to just reinforce this idea of setting up all of your layout styles. But we'll get into repeating groups later because that comes with its own set of responsive settings. So here I have this group for my, we'll call it group cards, to act as my starting point. And I want this to be a row group, right? Because I have things stacking horizontally, left to right. So this will be a row. And I'll add my first group inside of the row like this. Let's actually make it a lot bigger. Let's do maybe 150 by 200, like this. We'll start there. Obviously on the Airbnb it's much taller, but this will be good enough for us to get our example here. And I'm going to add a border with a roundness of 10 to create that card style. Maybe we add a little bit of a shadow like that. And inside of this group, I want things to stack vertically, right? So if I were to take another column, it's going to appear left to right like that. So we'll get there in a moment. But first thing I'm going to do is just design the one card and then just copy and paste that so I have the same design all the way through. Okay, so the first card, now it's bothering me. I'm going to make it a little bit wider. Let's do 200 by 300. All right, that feels a little bit better. This is going to be a column structure, and we're going to have, let's say, an image element inside of that column, right? That's going to be centered. It's probably not going to be fixed. It'll expand to the full width. And then what do we have? We have two texts, a larger text and then a smaller text down below it. Again, it'll stack below automatically. So larger text, right? Let's set it up with one of our headings there. There's our larger text, and here is our smaller text. Let's give this another heading. Maybe heading 5 like this. Maybe we'd change this to heading 3 to make that more obvious. And I'm going to create a little bit of spacing inside of this card so that we have some breathing room there. So some gap spacing, let's say 20 pixels. There we go. And we're going to vertically align the text inside of the column like this. Of course, I can get rid of my widths to have everything fitting perfectly around the text like that. That way the alignment is a little bit more accurate. Okay, so now they're much more perfectly centered. I could also get rid of that, have the height fit more to that content. But here's a good example, okay? Now if I copy this group and paste this, right, so now we're creating this structure that we're seeing on Airbnb as well. So here's some things that we can do to correct this behavior. First thing is that I don't want this fourth one to wrap around. There is plenty of room for another card. The reason it's wrapping around is because the parent container is fixed. Bubble is not allowing that to expand. So if I remove that, then it expands to the full width of its parent, in this case, the page. And I want my cards to be centered in that group, and I want to give them a little bit of spacing. So maybe we say 20 pixels, maybe a little more, let's say 40, right? So now we've created that structure as well. Again, keep in mind, for something like this, where the individual cards are going to have the same design but show different data, we would actually want to use a repeating group for that rather than creating a separate card every single time, because this is one of those things where the data might be unknown. The data needs to come from the database, or the number of items might be unknown. So a repeating group will help you generate that automatically, and you're literally only designing one cell, and it will duplicate things for you. And you do have controls over the positioning and the spacing and so on. All right, so that should be, hopefully that's helpful, you know, to see all the spacing and all the different settings that are involved here to create these layouts. You'll notice that you can create very quick wireframes for your page layouts just by playing around with these different settings and leveraging those groups, leveraging those containers and mixing and matching them, nesting groups within groups. The other example that I had open here was this Google Flights web page, where just to kind of show you another example of where you might find grids in the wild. All right, so we've got the menu on the left-hand side, very clearly a column structure. Everything is stacking top to bottom. And then here we have these cards, which have a combination of rows and columns, right? So this, what I'm calling a card, right, because it has that shadow on it, is going to be made up of a column, right? The card itself is a column. This is the first item in the column, and then this is the second item in the column. We have two rows inside of our column. And so those individual rows are other containers set up in a row structure. This one's fixed to the left, right? It's left aligned, whereas this one is has space around the elements, so we have those spacings. We might even be grouping these things together, these two date elements, to have them right next to each other with a little bit of spacing between these two guys here. So we have another group with just some simple text. This could be a good example of an aligned to parent one because you don't have very many things there. And then here we have, this is a perfect example of a lot of combined layout styles. We've got one giant row, right? Your whole left section here, and then your whole right section, the map. Within the left section, you have a column of 1, 2, 3 items in the column, and then within each item in the column, that's a row with the left side image, the right side details. And then again, inside of the right, you have your column with your text, text, text. So everything is really on a grid, and so that's what you need to get in the habit of leveraging when you're creating your layouts so that everything aligns very nicely and things are more intuitive. It's easier to create hierarchy on your page so that your user's eye is drawn to the right places, right? And you can do that, of course, by changing your font sizes. You can do that by how you section things off, what you highlight, what, the sizing of everything, and so on. All right, so we'll see you in the next video. Hopefully this was a helpful overview of all of the different container layouts and how the behaviors change between those. So I really encourage you to experiment and just get your hands on this to see how things are affected when you mess with all of these settings. All right, we'll see you in the next video.